this morning. Our Old Testament reading is in Proverbs 18, 1 through 12. I'm going to read that at this time. We read some of it in our responsive reading this morning. Proverbs 18, 1 through 12. An unfriendly person pursues selfish ends, and against all sound judgment starts quarrels. Fools find no pleasure in understanding, but delight in airing their own opinions. When wickedness comes, so does contempt, and with shame comes reproach. The words of the mouth are deep waters, but the fountain of wisdom is a rushing stream. It is not good to be partial to the wicked and so deprive the innocent of justice. The lips of fools bring them strife, and their mouths invite a beating. The mouths of fools are their undoing, and their lips are a snare to their very lives. The words of a gossip are like choice morsels that go down to the inmost parts. One who is slack in his work is brother to one who destroys. The name of the Lord is a fortified tower. The righteous run to it and are safe. The wealth of the rich is their fortified city. They imagine it a wall too high to scale. Before a downfall, the heart is haughty, but humility comes before honor. Our New Testament passage today, and this will be the passage I'll be speaking on, is Luke 18, 9 through 15. If you want to stand in honor of the gospel, that'd be appreciated. He also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. 2 men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus: God, I thank you that I'm not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week, I give tithes of all that I get. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to the house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. As you know, on Communion Sunday, I have a short sermon. So I'm going to try to stick to that. So I think some more people show up today for that reason. You don't have to listen to a long sermon. So I'll try to get at it because we have a few things we want to get to yet today. We are hardwired to quickly put people, and especially characters in a story, into categories. It is easy for us to put the Pharisee into the self-righteous, arrogant, judgmental, and the tax collector into the underdog, the humble, the broken, the one who really gets it. But life and people are messier than that, and so are Jesus' parables. If you've been in church much or listened to many sermons, it's easy to already have an impression of Pharisees. The term Pharisee has become synonymous with hypocrite. That's what we immediately can tend to think. We have a children's app on our phone for Bible stories, and whenever Pharisees show up, they just grumble. So we've started calling them the grumblers. And definitely in Scripture, there's lots of occurrences of them grumbling. Whenever Jesus would heal on the Sabbath, when people would worship Jesus, the Pharisees would typically respond with grumbling. So it's easy for us to feel sympathy for the tax collector, knowing that the tax collector was ostracized by society, on the outside looking in. Tax collectors were seen as collaborators with the Roman government, and this tax collector would not even probably have been welcome in the temple. So it's easy for us to see the Pharisee as being a self-righteous hypocrite, a judgmental jerk, so to speak. And this is somewhat how Jesus even paints the picture of this guy. He compares himself to sinners, and he sees himself as coming out on top. And then we see the brokenness and the humility of the tax collector, and our heart can easily go out to him. But to be clear and to be brief, this is not how those listening to Jesus would have heard this parable. They would have seen the Pharisee as the good guy. Pharisees were very much still respected at this point in history, in the Jewish history. And even all the accolades that the guy listed, the Pharisee, they would have seen him as going above and beyond the normal. He fasted twice a week. That was not required. He gave a tenth of everything. He was not required to give a tenth of everything, a tenth of some things. So the punchline for the listeners of that time would have been when Jesus said, I tell you, this man, the tax collector, went down to his house justified rather than the other, than the Pharisee. The listeners would have been stunned. What? The Pharisee is the righteous one. He is, in our terms, he's the super Christian. Not that they were Christian, the super Jew. So Jesus stuns the listeners with the point that the sinning tax collector went home right with God, whereas the Pharisee, who was going above and beyond, did not. Luke introduces this parable with some commentary, as he often does. Luke was a doctor, and this comes through in his writing. He liked to understand things and explain things. So Luke starts this parable with this. He, referring to Jesus, told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous, and they treated others with contempt. The New International Version says it this way: to some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable. Or in another form, the Message says it this way: he told this story to some who were complacently pleased with themselves over their moral performance, and they looked down their noses at the common people. A couple of points we can arrive at from Luke's introduction to this parable. First, Luke is making it very clear that it's not good to trust in your own righteousness, and it's not good to look down on others with contempt. The whole reason Jesus told this parable was to challenge those who had that mindset. Second, it would immediately raise the question, is Jesus talking about me? Am I like the Pharisee, or am I like the tax collector? You would be sitting there beginning to go through that process as you listen to Jesus. The tax collector went home right with God, and obviously the Pharisee was getting something wrong. What is the difference between the two of them? Well, first, the Pharisee trusted in his own good works as the source of his righteousness, while the tax collector believed he did not deserve to be righteous and was throwing himself on the mercy of God. Another way of saying it is the tax collector was humble and the Pharisee was full of pride. So what is humility? It's having an honest opinion of yourself. The tax collector cried out, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. And he was right. He was a sinner. And probably a pretty good one. And again, he was probably not welcome in the midst of the religious people because of their view of tax collectors. In today's culture, there is the thought or the belief that to be right with yourself, you need to accept all parts of yourself. There is something that's right in this idea, and there's something that is wrong. What is right is that accepting all parts of yourself means accepting the not desirable parts, the sinful parts, the broken parts, accepting them that they are a part of who you are, and that is true. The tax collector got it, that he had sin in his heart and in his life. The Pharisee didn't get it. He didn't get that he was a sinner. What's not right about this way of accepting all parts of yourself is meaning affirming everything about me is okay. That's just not true. If history of the world teaches us anything, if looking at culture teaches us anything, if looking even closely at ourselves teaches us anything, one thing it teaches us is that we all have sin, selfishness, and even evil within our lives, within our hearts. Yes, there is good as well. That is true. And there's another problem with this being right with yourself by accepting or affirming all parts of yourself. And that is we don't necessarily need to be right with ourselves. We need to be right with God. Amen. The tax collector got this, and the Pharisee did not. The tax collector could have used all these rationalizations and justifications that we use today to accept who he was and why he did what he did, and he could have justified it all, but he knew, I am not right with God. Whereas the Pharisee believed he was right with God when he really wasn't, because he was looking at himself and his good deeds. The Pharisee was living a lie. I'm fine, God and I are good, look at what I do, but he was missing the point of his own sin, that he was not right with God. The tax collector got that. He was living in truth. I am a sinner dependent upon God's mercy. Another difference between the two is who they focused on. The Pharisee focused on his own great religious works, and he focused on the sin of others, but the tax collector focused on his own sinfulness. The focus of the Pharisee led to pride in himself, condemnation of others, whereas the focus of the tax collector led to admission of guilt and a cry for mercy. So we have this tax collector who was justified before God because he was humble, he was honest, he was aware of his guilt, and he did not focus on others but on his own feelings. It's interesting, as I'm writing sermons, I'm pulled certain directions of how I want to write it or what I want to read into the text. And I kept wanting to make the tax collector a good guy. But he's not. He's not a good guy. He even admits that. I'm not a good guy. I'm not a good guy. There's a danger in doing that. These points I just mentioned about him being humble and broken and honest are good for us and challenging for us, but there's a danger in them. The danger is that we say, he did it right. Now, if I can do it right, that's good. What is the danger of that? We become the Pharisee all over again, wanting to do it right. And that's the trap of this parable that Jesus sets up. Again, Jesus is the greatest storyteller ever, and he tells everything for a reason. It's so interesting when you read through this parable over and over again, how you get pulled into wanting to make one guy good and one guy bad. And then I'm like, why do we want to do that? Because I want to figure it out the right way. Why? Because then I want to be right. Why? Because then I can feel good about myself. And then what do I become? The Pharisee all over again. It's such a trap. It's such a trap. But Jesus sets up this trap, because if you start lifting up one guy or the other guy, you're doing the same thing as he's warning about. So where does that leave us? Well, Jesus wraps up the parable with these words. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. Who does the humbling and who does the exalting? God does it. Who gave the tax collector mercy? God. God gave the tax collector mercy. The punchline of this parable is not so much about the tax collector getting it right and the Pharisee getting it wrong, but about the great mercy and grace of God. The tax collector realized that was the only hope he had, and that is true for all of us as well. The shocking part for the listeners of this day would have been that God's grace is really that good. They would have been like, what? This tax collector can even be forgiven? No way. No way. That's not fair. It's not right. Well, it's not, but that's grace, and that's mercy. Becky, if you could come forward and prepare communion. Today is Communion Sunday. This is when we partake of the Lord's Supper. If you're a believer in Jesus, you're welcome to join us. Our tradition is to line up here, come up around here. Some people kneel. You can stand. You can also stay in your seats if you want to be served in your seat. That's fine as well. It's when we remember the great sacrifice that Jesus made on the cross, and he asked us on that night to do this in remembrance of him, shedding his blood for us, giving his life for us, so that we would be right with God. As we partake today, may we, like the tax collector, know that it is only because of the mercy and grace of God that we are saved.